That's what Yeltsin did. He stood on that tank and he changed the narrative. And it gave him enormous political capital.
Hello, we've got another fabulous edition of the History Book Buffs today. We're talking about the last days of the Soviet Union. Always a jolly event. Anything that upsets Putin can't be too bad. A new book on the subject by the brilliant Robert Service, Professor Robert Service, formerly of Oxford University. And this is a subject that's, it's quite close to my heart. It's quite close to yours as well, isn't it, Antonia?
Yeah, that's right. It is the August Coup. It is the collapse of the Soviet Union, but centered around the heady days in mid-August 1991, in which the KGB attempted to assert control. I love anything in which the KGB attempts to assert control, particularly when they fail.
Brilliant. Now, look, I mean, let's dive straight into this. Tell us first of all, how does that summer of the August coup, how does it sort of play out? What are the main events that we're talking about? So Gorbachev is in Crimea on his holidays, and they go and interrupt him very rudely. But how do things go? And what was the immediate background to it?
Okay, so Robert Service opens his book with a brilliant set piece of Gorbachev's holiday. He's with Raisa on the Crimean coast in a very overly fancy dacha for a kind of, for the leader of a communist state. And he knows that things are sticky, right? So after his holiday, he is going to be signing something called a Union Treaty, which is a kind of renegotiation of the Soviet Union, giving kind of devolved powers to the Soviet republics. Now, this is deeply unpopular in some quarters, deeply popular in others. A lot of the people within the Soviet republics think it hasn't gone further enough. There's agitation for independence. And of course, the background to all of this, Roger Moorhouse, is a cost of living crisis. We all know how tumultuous a cost of living crisis can be on politics, right? We're seeing it now. I see it. I feel it every time I go for a top-up shop at Sainsbury's and I come out.
Every time you go to Waitrose, you feel it, don't you, Antonia?
Listen, I don't go to Waitrose. I don't know what to tell you. I've just destroyed all your stereotypes about me in one fell swoop. To be fair, it's only because there isn't a local one. Otherwise, I'd be face down in the kumquats.
Exactly. So anyway, you've got a cost of living crisis. I mean, basically, the Soviet economy is kind of collapsing, really, isn't it? They've tried to reform. You've got this, the famous glasnost and perestroika of the Gorbachev years, which are well-meaning, but the end result has been just turmoil, both, first of all, economic, and then, of course, as you said, that kicks into the political sphere. So that's what he's effectively reaping in that summer of 1991, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Robert Service describes Gorbachev as having, which I think was really interesting, is having an overly romanticized idea of what the immediate post-1917 Russian Revolution looked like. Gorbachev is unexpectedly, to some people, I think, a Leninist, right? He's a committed communist who thinks that everything went wrong when Lenin died, and that there was a kind of moment where bliss was really on the horizon, where you had kind of mass participation in politics, where you had the sort of new economic policy where there wasn't yet terror. I mean, you and I both think that this is a misreading of Leninism, actually. But for
completely.
Gorbachev, in Service's book, for Gorbachev, this is his kind of guiding principle that it's possible to reanimate the kind of dying corpse of the Soviet Union, which is economically lagging behind the West, which is, facing all the pressures that we know about. And that this is the way to kind of bring it back to life. And part of that is giving greater power to the Soviet republics, right? But he's sort of opening a can of worms, both economically and in terms of the devolution of power. So that's where we are in the run-up to this holiday, that he's supposed to be signing this new treaty on the 20th of August, 1991.
I mean, it is a very important point, because Gorbachev, I think, is like you said, and as Service says, has been a little bit misinterpreted, particularly in the West. You know, he was seen as the man who, you know, heroically, you know, let Eastern Europe go, and, you know, was jointly responsible for the end of the Cold War, the peaceful end of the Cold War, and so on. But as you said, his fundamental belief was that communism was a good thing and the Soviet Union was a good thing. He didn't want to destroy it, right? He wanted it to change and to reform so that it would survive. So it's a key difference.
Absolutely. And Robert Service's book, which, by the way, I should say straight off, I think is one of the best things he's ever written. And I'm a big fan of his. I think it is fantastic. Robert Service's book puts the August plots right at the center of the kind of narrative unfolding of what will happen. So it's what derails Gorbachev's plans. It's what it effectively leads to the dissolution, but much to the horror of the plotters of the Soviet Union. So he puts the August Coup absolutely central to the story of how the Soviet Union collapses. He also, interestingly, points out that there were two plots that summer, not just one, right? So the main characters in this, we're not going to go into as much detail as Service, because I would say that in his kind of background, the background chapters where he leads up to the plots, he is not shy of details and names. So some of it can get a bit
it does read a bit like the Moscow telephone directory occasionally, doesn't it?
It does, but it really picks up pace once once he gets over the background and starts moving back into the coup again. It's brilliant. Anyway, what he points out is there are three lead characters who we should just sum up. So there's obviously Gorbachev, who we briefly mentioned. Another main character in this story is obviously Yeltsin. So Boris Yeltsin is not a communist. He is a very pugnacious, bullish politician who will go on, as we all know, to have a terribly tormented relationship with alcohol. But he is effectively a Russian nationalist, right? And this is another one of the things that has been largely forgotten about the collapse of the Soviet Union. Is part of what was going on was nationalism in the peripheries in the old Soviet republics, but there was also a surge of nationalism in the heart of the project in Russia itself. And Yeltsin is the man. The third person we need to really sort of establish as we kind of as this story unfolds is the leader of the KGB, whose name is Khrushchev.
Yeah.
Khrushchev. Me and my Russian names, regular readers.
I know it's your strong suit.
I know.
You just carry on showing off.
History. I know. I'm in love with Russian history, and I can't say any of the names. That's why I'm better reading it than talking about it. Anyway, Khrushchev he wasn't a KGB lifer. He was a kind of party man who was then brought into the KGB earlier by Andropov. And in 1988, Gorbachev makes him chairman of the KGB. And actually, with some irony, he does this because he thinks he can push him around. He thinks he can tell him what to do. He's a workaholic. He's very serious, and to the suspicion of some of the Russians around him, he's not a big drinker, which
not a good sign.
No, right, totally sinister behaviour, not being too much of a vodka hound.
So what do the plotters want? You know, they're confining Gorbachev to his dacha, as you described, on his holiday. So what do they actually want?
Well, just before we talk about that, we need to talk about the other kind of semi-coup in the beginning of July, right? Which Service puts real emphasis on, I think, correctly. So what he says is that Gorbachev needs to get through his kind of this new plan, this new union treaty to kind of change the way the Soviet Union is run. And for that, he needs Yeltsin. So he's kind of having these meetings in this sort of another one of these kind of like, semi-imperial dachas, right? And him and Yeltsin need to have a private meeting. So they go out onto the balcony because they think they won't be listened to. They know the place is being bugged by the KGB, but they think if they go on the balcony, and they're with the president of Kazakhstan, I think, as well, they think if the three of them talk out there, they'll be safe. Unwittingly, unknowingly to them, they have completely naively underestimated the strength of the KGB bugs. And there is an entire recording of basically Yeltsin demanding from Gorbachev that he sack a load of his key personnel, right?
Mm-hmm.
Khrushchev gets hold of this because, it's a KGB transcript, and he's then able to use this to mobilize a coup that he's already mulling, right? Because he gets to be able to go to some of these senior people that Gorbachev is handing on a kind of platter as a kind of, as a sop to Yeltsin. He goes to them and he says, look, he's betraying you, so come in with me, right? So this is crucial. And I think service is fun. It is great to emphasize that. So the coup, we're supposed to be signing this treaty on the 20th of August, but on the 4th of August, he goes on holiday, Gorbachev, and people find this kind of quite weird. So then Khrushchev, behind the scenes, starts sort of marshalling his allies. And in terms of what he wants, basically, I can quote from service here. The coup leaders wanted to save the Union, reassert Soviet international authority, secure economic regeneration, and fend off Russia's obstructive demands. Now, very interestingly, he later on in the book says it's basically a kind of an early prototype of Putinism, right? They want a big, powerful Russia with some concessions to kind of economic liberalization, but they want the Soviet Union intact. They want it to not be so embarrassed on the world stage. This comes after, as Russia's economy is collapsing after kind of the years of perestroika, etc. That summer, Gorbachev has just gone to the G7 cap in hand, really embarrassingly and publicly asking for money, which he was denied, right? So on the world stage, the Soviet Union, which once sort of bestrode the world like a colossus, is beginning to look a bit pathetic. And this is really what they're cross about, right? This is really what's making
So it's a humiliation, isn't it?
Yeah. So Khrushchev basically sends some of his KGB henchmen. They cut off all the communications with the Dacha. They isolate Raisa, who's there, Gorbachev's wife, and Gorbachev, and they declare that they are effectively an interim government, and under a kind of the auspices of something they call the State Committee. And he's got a really, really powerful team initially, right? He's got like his own deputies. He's got the former foreign minister. He's got the deputy president of the USSR, who he reluctantly persuades to take over as a kind of interim president. So Khrushchev has really set up the coup rather brilliantly. He's moved quickly. He's moved efficiently. He's got all the right people on board. And then he makes a couple of quite big mistakes.
Which are?
Right. So the biggest mistake is they don't neutralize Yeltsin.
Yeah.
Right. So Yeltsin at this stage is the president of Russia, right? Yes. And he's got a kind of tidal wave of support on that basis. Service says,
I mean that is a pretty big omission on the plotter's part, because Yeltsin was to some extent, like you described before, he's a little bit like the tail wagging the dog at this point, isn't he? I mean, he is, of course, he's a big tail. Russia's the largest, most populous republic of the Soviet Union. So he's an extremely powerful man within that framework, but he is the one that essentially has the whip hand in the coming politics. So you'd think they would have thought they had to isolate him somehow.
Well, he did. He would have the whip hand in the coming months after the failure of the plot, right? Before the failure of the plot, yes, he is still incredibly crucial, and it was a terrible mistake. Service contends that actually Gorbachev and Yeltsin, who really hated each other, but Yeltsin was sort of tolerated by Gorbachev and given a bit of a free rein, because Yeltsin was pushing ahead a lot faster with the economic reforms that Gorbachev wanted to do than Gorbachev was. So Yeltsin was pushing them in Russia in a way that Gorbachev didn't feel that he had the political capital to do in the wider Soviet Union. So he was he thought at that point that he was using Yeltsin, right? So the relationship between them is tortured and difficult, but before the August coup, there's a level of parity, right? But yes, absolutely, the plotters must have spent the next, however many years ruining the fact they screwed up. So they did send a party of KGB men to arrest Yeltsin, and then that kind of didn't work. And then Yeltsin and his fellow Russian kind of senior politicians were all kind of holidaying in their dachas in the same kind of area. And again, they didn't. The KGB element did not act to neutralize those Russian politicians, right?
Yeah.
I think, possibly because they were still caught within this mindset that the entity that mattered was the Soviet Union, right?
Yeah.
Not quite understanding the shift that had been happening, and also the fact that if the coup fails in Moscow, it fails everywhere, right?
Yeah.
And so basically what happens is Yeltsin leaves his dacha. He's quite brave, and then he puts on his tie. There's a nice detail in Robert Service's book where he sort of snaps at his, wife and daughters, like, where are my socks? I'm the president, I need socks, like, as he sort of sets off.
That's the way things were in the 90s.
Yeah, exactly. It's well in Russia anyway. Yeah. Anyway, he travels and he manages to get to the White House, the Russian White House, which is the Russian parliamentary building. Where he kind of sets up camp.
Yeah.
And
then famously climbs on a tank, as I remember.
Yeah, so he climbs on a tank and he makes this speech and he rejects the authority of the State Committee. And which
is really interesting. It's very un-Soviet behaviour, right? Soviet leaders up until that point, with partial exception of Gorbachev, because Gorbachev did go and glad hand and do walkabouts and things like that. But hardly anybody, like go way back, go back to Stalin. None of them would do walkabouts because of security and all the rest of it. So to actually go out to the troops that supposedly have been ranged against you, and to climb on their tank and shake hands with the tank commander and start talking to them and then give a speech to the cameras. It's kind of Western politics. It's not Soviet politics, the way it's being done, right?
Yeah, I think so. And I went and I watched it again on YouTube. And I think my kind of memories of Yeltsin have been overlaid by the sort of shambling boozer that comes later.
Yeah.
And actually, when you see him standing on that tank and doing that address, and he is drinking a lot at this stage, but he doesn't look like a drunk in the way that he will later. He's so impressive. Actually, you can see why there was this groundswell of support in Russia for him, and there was, and this is one of the issues. So that the streets around Moscow are full of like pro-Yeltsin protesters. The coup leaders are feeling it slipping out of their hands. Then Khrushchev kind of decides that he's going to storm the White House, and he kind of taps up this group of KGB special forces called Alpha Force, who've done some stuff in Afghanistan and were kind of, I guess, like the SAS kind of thing. And he's going to do it, but he's a bit slow, he's a bit nervous, and then slowly he kind of loses the initiative. And by the time he decides it's time, there's so many people on the streets of Moscow that the KGB know that if they if they try and storm the White House, they're going to take out Russian civilians, and this is a bad look. So it's a difficult call to make. And then the leader of the Alpha Force, who himself is kind of quite a powerful figure within the KGB organization, he basically says, I'm not doing it. Which then puts Khrushchev in a like almost impossible situation. He can sense the coup is slipping away at that point, right? This is the point at which it's kind of slipping away. And the service is again really brilliant on this, about the fact that the KGB at this point were relying on a kind of memory of menace, to sort of control people.
Yeah.
He didn't think
But
you
they
would
no
have.
longer had no longer had the will somehow, did they? They're you know, it's like they're like the giant with feet of clay. They're a huge organization, but have they really got the will to do this?
It has been a long time since Russian Soviet state police have used mass terror. I mean, a
Mm,
really long time. You know, there's that for a very long while they have relied on non-lethal measures of control.
yeah,
And where things have turned lethal, so there'd been a protest in Vilnius in
yeah,
1990, from
90,
memory,
yeah, yeah,
where 14 people ended up dead. And it was actually shocking. And if you think 14 people ending up dead is not ideal, but like, you know, Stalinist state police, 14 people is your
that's
warm-up act,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Not
yeah. That's
even
before
your
breakfast.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So it's a different organization that still conceives of itself as having a kind of aura of menace and terror that will
mm,
mean that people comply, but the people of Moscow do not comply, which
yeah,
is in itself fascinating.
yeah,
Um, and he expected the way that Service tells the story, you know, he's the KGB chief. He expects a Soviet level of kind of docile consent.
mm,
But you know, this is the years of perestroika and glasnost. People had begun to feel like they were allowed to dissent publicly,
yeah.
and that was very difficult to put back
Because
into.
that was one of the things that Gorbachev kind of gave them and allowed them, right? So crucially, they were exercising it. But it's really interesting that I think, you know, it's so obvious that the ground has shifted beneath all of their feet. You know,
Mm,
both Gorbachev as a reformer and the old KGB people. The ground has shifted so radically because of Gorbachev's reforms in the previous 5 years that you know they still think they're in control of this process, but it's actually slipped out of their hands, right? So the Soviet Union is kind of a walking corpse at this point, and the same the KGB is kind of a walking corpse. It no longer has the power, no longer has the ability to reform itself or to you know pull itself up by its own you know hideous bootstraps.
this is true, although I think we always have to be quite careful, don't we, of kind of assuming inevitability too early.
Mm,
So Service does, for example, think about the fact, would it have been possible for the Soviet Union to explore a kind of more gradualist approach that looked a bit more like Chinese
mm,
capitalist communism?
mm,
And he made some really good points around that. The first being that the Chinese benefited enormously from Western technology, but part of the Cold War strategy was to strangle Russia and stop it getting hold of any Western technology. And that was what part of what Gorbachev had been asking for at that G7 summit was more access to this world.
right.
But the Soviet Union was being left so far behind that it was almost impossible to catch up.
Yeah.
So it's kind of chicken and egg at that point. They needed Western technology to be able to catch up, but the West was refusing to give it until they had reformed economically and legally to ape the West, right? So
Yeah.
they were in a real bind.
Yeah.
The sense you get actually from Service's book is sort of the notion that yes, the ground had shifted and nobody knew what to do. It's one of
Mm,
those moments in history, I think, where like, you know, I always um kind of we've talked a lot privately, you know, when we chat about this idea that sometimes there's nobody in charge because everybody's befuddled.
mm,
It's a bit like sort of, you know, at the beginning of the financial crisis or any of the moments that we've seen in history where you kind of think, or even COVID, where you hope that somewhere there's a grown up who actually understands the process and is pulling the levers, right?
yeah.
I think
Rachel
this,
Reeves, for example. Yeah.
yeah, I think like, this is one of these moments where you feel like nobody even knows where the levers are. And even
Yeah.
if they found them, they wouldn't know which ones to yank. You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Oh, we're back on Rachel Reeves. Sorry about
Wow.
that.
Anyway, so yeah, so the coup is sort of sliding away from him or from them. Um, Basically, there's three more protesters are kind of killed in a sort
Yeah.
of, almost an accidental firefight in a different part of Moscow. And that really sort of almost is it.
Yeah.
Again, can you imagine a KGB that's spooked by the killing of three people? But
Yeah,
this
and
was,
sort of everyone was spooked by that in a weird way, weren't they? I mean, again,
yeah,
that would have been par for the course in back in the day, but that three or deaths of ordinary people,
yeah.
suddenly everybody kind of goes, "Oh my God, we must step back from the brink."
I know, exactly. And it's really interesting. So the coup begins on the 19th of August, effectively, and very quickly all the plotters start falling out. Khrushchev is losing, momentum. By the 22nd, Service has a beautiful line. He says, "The coup was like milk souring in the sun."
Nice.
So then both a Russian delegation and Khrushchev kind of decide to go out to see Gorbachev to try and kind of, almost as if he can be put back in charge and tell them what to do,
Yeah.
because actually they're free, everything is moving beyond their control. And so they go to the Crimea, they see Gorbachev, and effectively release him from house arrest. And Gorbachev puts Khrushchev in prison, and then he takes over theoretical control. But
But the genie's
Service,
out of the bottle.
the genie's out of the bottle. I mean, this is basically Yeltsin's moment. He's a bit. Do you know what it reminded me a bit of? It reminded me of Zelensky. That moment where history comes knocking and you manage to stand tall in front of the world and change the narrative, right? And that's what Yeltsin did. He stood on that tank and he changed the narrative, and it gave him enormous political capital. Um, and so he kind of takes charge. So Gorbachev is theoretically in charge. Meanwhile, Yeltsin is kind of unilaterally granting independence to the Baltic states, even though he doesn't really have the authority to do so. And then, again, and then it's him who effectively lets Ukraine go. And then everybody is kind of confronted with what is in effect, a kind of Russian um dissolution of the Soviet Union. It's a
Yeah.
Russian nationalist project, uh,
Yeah.
with the coup as the catalyst for all of it.
Yeah. So by the end of that year, I mean, that you've got by the end of that year, it all happens very quickly. So this is August, the coup. And by the
Yeah,
end of the year, you've got the creation of the CIS, the Commonwealth of Independent States, which is kind
yeah,
of the successor, but as the name suggests, supposedly sovereign states,
yeah.
with the exception of the Baltic states that go their own way, of course, as we know. And then right at the end of the year, they pull down the red flag from the Kremlin,
No,
and the Soviet Union is no more. So it literally lasts another 4 months after the August
it's
coup.
incredible. It's incredible. And I before I'd read Robert's book, I just called him Robert. I never met him. That feels hubristic. Robert Service's book. Until I'd read the book, I don't think I had understood properly how central the coup was. And the irony, of course, for the plotters is they got the exact opposite of what it
Of
was
what they
that they
wanted.
wanted.
Yeah, exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
and it took Putin to reanimate the corpse of the plot, really,
Yeah,
which is
that's true.
another fascinating element that I hadn't really
Yeah.
appreciated.
So one
Uh,
of the sort of subtexts of Service's book is to make the case that there are, I think the way he puts it is that the embryo of Putinism is there under Gorbachev, right? The corruption, the sort of authoritarian tendencies, and so on. So all of that is there, he says, in Soviet thinking in under Gorbachev at the end.
yeah.
So in a sense, it just has to be, like you said, I mean, just has to be reanimated under Putin, which
That
will be 10 years later or 9 years later.
that is right. But then also, I mean, he makes the point that it's also the kind of the way that the economic reforms are carried out by Yeltsin, the cronyism and the corruption that happens immediately, and like Yeltsin before he really took over, he would get the bus places with his wife, but as soon as he took over, he's suddenly
Yeah.
milking it just like everybody else is. And
Yeah.
that kind of cronyism and corruption absolutely takes hold. And one of the things I thought was really interesting, and this was sort of a sentence in the book, but I was thinking, well, maybe it was inevitable that, like, you can't switch from a kind of state-planned communist society to somewhere that works as a kind of working capitalist system
Yeah.
without, horrors. And I thought, well, the Baltics did it, right? I mean, there are
Yeah.
other reasons why the Baltics managed it, but political leadership was a very strong part of it. It was political
Yeah.
leadership in the Baltics that created and, a sort of shared goal to become kind of, westernized and part
Yeah.
of Europe rather than, Russia has all its, all the problems we know of as of kind of a kind of identity crisis where it stands with Europe.
Mm.
But for the Baltic states managed to create economies that were based on the rule of law and minimal corruption,
Yeah.
which is, fantastic. And
Yeah.
yet Russia, as we know,
Didn't.
didn't. What's it?
Yeah.
Service again. He said Gorbachev sleepwalked to one of the most corrupt variants of capitalism possible, which I
Yeah.
thought was a wonderful way of putting it.
Yeah. Absolutely right. And one interesting point. I know we've got to close, but one of the interesting point that he does make, Service, in the book is that I think he's relatively positive and kind of praising of Yeltsin, which I thought was quite interesting. I stress relatively because, as you said before, the stereotype that we have of Yeltsin is of a bumbling drunk. You remember that scene where he sort of got up on stage? It must have been one of his quasi-election campaigns, and he was drunk and he was kind of dancing like a granddad, and he just became known as that sort of bumbling drunk. But there was much more to him, and I've always thought this, that actually I think Yeltsin will be. History will be kinder to Yeltsin than it is now in the future, because of what he tried to achieve. Okay, the corruption, the cronyism, all of that, but he did try. He had some sort of vision for a modern, free, reasonably democratic Russia, that was stillborn, but he's still, the 90s were still, in some respects, a relatively positive decade, not in the economy, of course, but, there was this sort of growing openness.
Perhaps there was openness, but, at the end of the day, Yeltsin's failures
Led to Putin.
led to Putin.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true.
And, there's reasons why the Russians despise Gorbachev and Yeltsin for how it ended.
Yeah, that's true.
But listen, I think we should sum up that this is an absolutely brilliant book and everybody should buy it. Honestly, I have read very few things I admire as much. It's got unbelievable narrative pace. Like,
And the set pieces are fantastic as well, aren't they? They really are.
Yeah, like,
really
as I
well
say,
done.
there's a few chapters at the beginning that lag a bit as you kind of go through Gorbachev's economic reforms, but as soon as you get back into the coup, it's absolutely marvelous, and I really loved it.
Yeah.
Have you got any other books, Roger, that you like on this period?
It's pretty. I mean, it's still pretty fresh because this is interesting because there's lots of stuff, as we've said before, about 89. The collapse in Central Europe, and what's so interesting, I think, is how different, the sort of topography of 91 in the Soviet Union is from what happens in 89 in Eastern Europe, right? I mean, of course they're linked, but the way in which all of that happens and plays out is kind of very different. And I think that's quite fascinating because you might assume it's only 2 years between them, collapse of communism in one place versus the collapse of communism somewhere else. You'd imagine it was the same drivers that are doing it, but it's kind of not, right? Which I think is fascinating. It's also quite disconcerting, I would say, to read history where the events that you're reading about are things that you can quite clearly remember and quite clearly remember thinking about and considering as an adult, not even as a child, right? I know you were a child in 1991, Antonia, but unfortunately for me, I wasn't. So I can actually remember all of this playing out. I was at university. We talked about this all the time as it was going on. It was crazy. So that I find quite disconcerting to think that is already history.
It's amazing though that you can just go on YouTube and see it all playing out.
Yeah,
I love that.
Yeah, that too. It's
the one wonderful thing about doing really modern stuff. Roger, tour de force. By me, I don't know. Normally I say,
of course.
yeah. But listen, thank you so much for listening to me rabbit on about this brilliant book, and everybody should go out and buy it, and we will put the links in the show.
Wonderful. So Robert Service, and it is The August Coup, out now. Go and buy it, people.